and welcome to the IT Drive podcast, your window into how IT at PMI is propelling our journey towards a smoke-free future. And I'm your host, Michael Voegele. At PMI, we're on a historic journey to create a future without cigarettes, driven by our commitment to our consumers, shareholders, and society as a whole. Underpinning this bold ambition is a sweeping digital business transformation that is reshaping our operations, our systems, processes, workflows, but also our culture. This transformation is a seismic shift with many moving parts. To help us unpack some pressing issues that come with this change, I'm pleased to welcome my very special guest, AWS Enterprise Strategist Mark Schwartz. In addition to his role at AWS, Mark has penned several influential books, including The Art of Business Value, The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy, and Adaptive Ethics for Digital Transformation. A former CIO in multiple sectors, Mark is also sought after speaker on topics such as DevOps, change leadership, and IT innovation. Considering the exponential growth of AI technologies that came with the start of Gen AI and their related implication when it comes to ethics and bureaucracy, I can think of no better person to help me dive into these themes and their real-world impact on digital business transformations. So without further ado, let's get started. Mark, I'm so happy to have you as my guest today and as a colleague to speak about digital transformation. Welcome to our Drive podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
Mark, when we look at current publications, and let us get right into the questions here as well. When we look at what's happening at the moment, what I was stunned about is how center stage discussions are around ethics nowadays when we talk about technology, but also when we talk about digital transformation. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is this ethics and specifically ethical consideration in context of technology?
Sure. First of all, I think it's great that it's a topic of discussion now. It's an important thing to be thinking about, and it's not obvious how to approach it. I think it's important not just to focus down on the, sort of the big issues as the media defines them for us. Is AI going to take over the world? How should you behave when you're dealing with robots? Those kinds of things. Ethics is a bigger subject in the business world, and I think digital transformation brings that out. I think a lot of ways of behaving and thinking about how we should behave come from a more bureaucratic way of structuring organizations that's changing a lot now in the digital world. And I think that affects how we approach these ethical questions that are coming up. And in my book, I wanted to provoke people a little bit to maybe think differently. Let's go back to the basics on some of these ethical questions.
What are those basics that you're talking about, Mark? I mean, your book is very interesting, and I think, ethics coming center stage, and all of a sudden you bring bureaucracy also into the conversation. Yeah. Everybody was used to talk about technology. Now we talk about really fundamental things.
I know. It's an unusual approach, I admit it. The book I wrote before the ethics book was a book about bureaucracy. And as I was writing it, I realized that there are a lot of ethical concerns around bureaucracy that maybe aren't so obvious. So that's kind of what drove me to write the book on ethics. It's not obvious to most people, but bureaucracy is actually an ethics. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean. First of all, I should say, for me, bureaucracy doesn't necessarily have negative connotations. I'm using the word bureaucracy in sort of the academic sense. A bureaucracy is a form of social organization that involves division of labor, hierarchy, rules impartially applied, kind of an impersonal approach by the people who are applying it, and a couple of other considerations. This mostly comes from the sociologist Max Weber, who was writing around 1920. So let's say that's what bureaucracy is about. And every company, more or less, is set up as a bureaucracy, if you think about the criteria that I just said. So
Yeah.
companies have hierarchy, they have division of labor based on functional specialties, and very interestingly, they have this impersonality, which is absolutely crucial to bureaucracy. And this is maybe the starting point for understanding the ethics of a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies try to be fair by saying same rules apply to everybody. And if you work in a bureaucracy, your job is to leave yourself at home. Don't bring any of your prejudices, biases, anything basically to work. Just follow the rules and apply the rules equally to everyone. That's an ethical position, right?
Yeah.
Impersonality is a critical value of bureaucracy. There are other ethical stances that you get in bureaucracy. For example, you should defer to people higher than you in the hierarchy. Your employer owns your time while you're at work. And if you're not productive during that time, you're stealing from your employer, essentially. So there are all these ethical aspects to bureaucracy. And I think you can probably already see what I'm getting at. Those principles don't necessarily hold in the digital world, or they're not what's most important to us. If you're working from home and you're working at odd hours of the day because you're working with people in other time zones, maybe that buying your time is not really the right model. Is impersonality really the right model? When we encourage diversity, we tell people, bring yourself to work, that's valuable to us as a company. So a lot of these values maybe don't make as much sense right now. And that was what got me thinking about ethics and looking at what's really transforming here when it comes to how we think about ethics.
Now it's interesting. So you talked a lot about, the bad side of the bureaucracy, but if I recall correctly, you also mentioned the good side of bureaucracy. So what can we use from that actually in context of rethinking our ethical standards in an organization? How will it help us to continue to transform?
Yeah. I wanted to make people think a little bit. So I knew if I said there are good things about bureaucracy, that would focus people on trying to figure out why I was wrong. The fact is that number one, bureaucracies are the way that we structure organizations, and we do it for a reason. Bureaucracy arose essentially with the Industrial Revolution because companies started to take on global scale and they became very big. And how do you manage a very big organization? Well, the way that they found was to have these kinds of structures, these bureaucratic structures. Today, bureaucracy is very important because of compliance regimes. So essentially, compliance frameworks say you must be bureaucratic. You have to have certain types of controls in the organization. People at the top of the organization have to be able to sign off on things the organization is doing. All of that sort of forces bureaucracy. What's more important and what's interesting is that you can have good bureaucracy and bad bureaucracy. And most of what we rebel against when we hate bureaucracy is those characteristics of bad bureaucracy, which, as I say in my book, are not necessarily a part of bureaucracy. You can fight bureaucracy by trying to get rid of the bad characteristics. How does that impact the way that we try to transform? Well, often bureaucracy is providing guardrails and frameworks for the context for everything that you're doing. You're doing it in an organization, and that organization probably has those bureaucratic structures. However, back to the downsides of bureaucracy for a moment. The bureaucratic way of thinking encourages us to think in terms of rules. Bureaucracy is all about rules. And our first impulse when we think about AI ethics, for example, or any other new ethical considerations, we first tend to think, what are the rules that we have to follow? You know, tell me, what are the rules? Because I'm a leader and I want to know, how I have to behave. I need a starting point for my ethics. So we focus on rules. We also focus on rules when we think about how society should react. We say it's important to make rules really quickly for AI and for other things, privacy and so on. That is very much the sort of bureaucratic way of thinking. It's interesting in the world of ethics and philosophical ethics, at about the same time that bureaucracy became critical to businesses, the Industrial Revolution, what was going on in the philosophy world at the same time was essentially the Age of Enlightenment. Here I'm talking about Western philosophy specifically. Age of Enlightenment, and the approaches to ethics were generally rule-based. Deontology, it's called. Duty ethics. Here's your duty. These are the things that you got to do. For most of the history of philosophy, that's not how people thought about ethics. It wasn't all about rules. And I suggest that today, rules might not be the critical way of thinking about ethics. They're important, not saying they're not important, but rather than saying, what are the rules, which is hard to say because there aren't a lot of rules yet, and because there's so much uncertainty, it's hard to know what the rules should be. Rather than thinking in terms of rules, we should be thinking in terms of what's good behavior. How does a good person act? What we call virtues in the world of philosophical ethics. Or you can even think of it as values. What are the right values to have, and how to apply them? Or for businesses, there's a second way of thinking about it that I think is important, which is, what's the social contract? What is our implicit agreement with society? And that can change over time, and it probably will. But those two ways of thinking about ethics, what are the virtues? So me as a person in an enterprise, this is how I should act. And what is our implicit understanding with society? What's the social contract? That those are better ways than immediately reaching for rules.
Which is quite interesting because this week we saw Joe Biden issuing an executive order with the intent to regulate AI, putting rules in place, asking the NIST organization to create standards and so forth. So does it mean we as businesses, as people, have actually failed to define ethical standards so that now the rules have to come in?
Well, I think the discussion about rules is a great discussion because people's intuitions aren't too clear on these things. So the process of formulating rules, I think, is very productive, and it makes you think about things. Just like discussion about biases in AI force us to think about our own biases and how are they making their way into AI and what do we mean by bias exactly. The discussion is very productive. Rules can serve okay as guidelines, but the problem with rules and bureaucracy in general, I'm sure you've seen this, is it lends itself to this sort of legalistic nitpicking. I technically didn't tell you a lie, even though I deliberately deceived you. And I think in a complex environment like we're in, saying, oh, this is the rule, and I didn't disobey the rule, even though I did horrible things, that's not productive. The better question is, how should I act as a person, or what makes a person a good person? And I should act that way. And yes, stay within the rules, whatever they are. But in my day-to-day activities, generally, I'm not bumping up against the rules, but I still have to act ethically.
I mean, this sounds very interesting, but when I think about it, it is potentially that every individual would come up with their own standards in context of what they believe good looks like. So what is the role of businesses, and how does it need to be, a really senior executive conversation in organizations when it comes to that. When I recall, a lot of times it was also about rules. This is the values, these are the behaviors, this is what makes great leader. So rules. But at the end, it is about how you take those rules into your daily thinking, into your daily decision making, how you collaborate with individuals across and outside of the organization. So how do we get this, I would say, taking a little bit away the rules, which give us the guardrails, but then move it into the actual behavior of individuals in organizations, in the way how they interact, but at the end of the day, potentially how they build products, not just Gen AI, large language models, but products that they bring into the market.
Yeah, I love the direction you're going there, because what I noticed as I was writing is that what I'm saying is very similar to what digital practices say. So instead of working from a fixed set of requirements, often more agile ways of working, say, here's the intent. Now it's up to a decentralized team to figure out exactly how to apply that intent, because the world is so complex, you can't centralize all the decision making. So I'm saying something similar when it comes to ethics. You can't make standards. I shouldn't say you can't. It's less productive in many cases, right? Standards alone don't solve the problem. In concrete, actual situations, actual people have to figure out how to apply the principles and apply the virtues, and it's very complex. And if you ignore that complexity, then you're going to have this very hollow ethics, where people take it as a legalistic thing. So it's not that everybody has their own set of ethics. What we agree on as a company or as a society is what is virtuous behavior? What are the virtues? Virtues is an old-fashioned sounding, word. So maybe let's say values. It's technically not exactly right, but what are the key values? And the values in my book, I propose about 15 or so. There are necessarily going to be a lot, but what do we value? We value authenticity and sincerity. We value courage in many ways. We value inclusion. There are a number of values that we more or less share. And if you are acting in accordance with those values, then you are probably doing the right things. And of course, you can get feedback, just like with anything else, that you didn't quite do the right thing. But it's up to your personal. Ultimately, you have to make decisions, and that means you have to weigh off these different virtues and how they apply to the particular situation. And yes, I'm saying, it really is decentralized in a way, ethics.
Is that when you talk about it, these 15 things, now when we talk about inclusion and diversity, are they agnostic to where you come from and how you've been raised? Are they really common across the world?
Well, they are not. There are different sets of values in different cultures, for sure. There is probably an underlying set of values that are pretty common across cultures. And then there are some differences. And I think as a company, you've got to make some decisions about, whose values apply exactly.
Yeah.
But a second point I want to make on this, in a company specifically, is that this is much more a question of company culture than anything else. In other words, in the company, certain values are reinforced. And studies show it's usually the local work group of the person that is giving them reinforcement on whether they're being ethical, and whether they're following the right values. So a company has to create a culture of ethical behavior. There's room there to say, as a company, here's what we believe, here are the values that we have. And then that gets reinforced by the culture, so people use those values in making decisions. I think people also bring their own personal values. But one thing that occurred to me as I was writing also is, if you look at big ethical failures, I mean, the easy one to think about is Enron. Um, Enron had ethical principles. Ethical principles. It's kind of funny to say that. They had a code of conduct that was 64 pages long. Here's how you should behave. They had a banner in their lobby with their key corporate values on it, integrity and respect and so on. Clearly, people in the organization did not follow any of those things. To me, that is the way they did it, is sort of the bureaucratic approach. Here's a code of conduct, and it has a bunch of rules in it. And those rules we're publishing because legal liability. You know, we want to be able to say we told everybody behave this way. But the culture didn't reinforce those values. The culture reinforced a completely different set of values. And as a result, people making decisions applied that very different set of values. So in a company, a lot of it is about culture, just like, digital transformation in general.
It's interesting because if I recall my experience being in different companies, there was always a big conversation about what is the culture that we need. Do the values need to change in a digital world? And what you always saw was exactly what you explained. You saw posters, you saw mandatory trainings.
Yes.
But from your practical experience, how do you really get this into a large organization as we are in PMI? Have you ever found that secret sauce to actually get to the core of it, so it's actually lived in an organization?
Yeah, I think it's like any other cultural change. And so we see almost every organization that's trying to do a digital transformation has to solve that problem. How do you change the culture? And the techniques that work generally, I think, can work for ethical behavior as well. I'll give you a few ideas of things that I've seen work. One is Amazon itself. That's an easy one to reach for. Amazon has 16 leadership principles. They're not necessarily all, around ethics. They're around how we do business. 16 leadership principles, and they are not just on a poster. They are very much a part of everything we do every day. And we hire people based on those principles. We hire people who can demonstrate that they use those principles. We give people feedback in terms of those principles. One principle, for example, is bias for action. And there's a whole explanation of what that means to us. And so it would be normal for a manager to say to one of their employees, I'm not sure you showed bias for action on such and such. So feedback is given in terms of these things. In decision making and discussion, the principles are used. So maybe I argue with you about something, and we say, that's good. You need to have backbone and disagree and commit. And at some point, you need to commit to the common solution. And when you do, then you're committed, and you're going to make it a part of what you do, instead of being sort of passive aggressive, I told you so kind of thing. And maybe we settle our disagreement by saying, is my answer or your answer more customer obsessed? Because customer obsession is so these are part of our day-to-day activities. And one way that we make them part of those activities is through mechanisms, we call them. So processes that force people to think about those principles.
Okay.
Right? So we've built a whole culture that reinforces those principles. That's the Amazon way of thinking about it. What I found in general from most companies is that culture, actually I'm borrowing from a book by Edgar Schein, who's a great thinker about these things. Culture forms around patterns of success. So people figure out what makes them successful, and then they reinforce the behaviors that make them successful by making it part of the culture. This is the way we do things around here. And the way that you change a culture is by changing the definition of success. So in a digital transformation, you're not going to transform unless the things that made people successful yesterday don't make them successful today. there are different incentives or different definitions of success or whatever. So incentives in the very broadest sense, what behaviors get rewarded? When do you get the pat on the head? What sorts of behaviors?
It's quite interesting. I just had a reflection because if I recall correctly, in Amazon, one of the 16 is you don't get extra credits for growing your budgets and your teams.
That's not actually one of the 16, but it
It's
happens
not?
to be. It does happen to
I
be
thought
two.
it's one, but
Yeah,
at the end, this
yeah,
is actually a behavior we have.
it's a
The more
behavior.
people, the more budget, the higher your grade. So
Yeah,
it's
and I
actually
would.
really about rethinking, reshaping, reimagining how the processes are executed, and with that, bringing those values and ethical standards into real life.
Yes, and I would say, what you said is true. That is something we believe in, and it comes from the leadership principles. So, uh, if you combine two of the leadership principles, customer obsession and frugality, the implication. So, frugality says make the most of a small set of resources. Get the most out of a small set of resources. So, growing your division and having more people and so on, that's generally not frugal if you can do the same amount of customer obsession with a smaller set of resources. So it's a behavior that's generally going to be looked at negatively.
Okay.
In some cases, it's a good idea to grow, but it's not necessarily.
Okay. Mark, drawing from your extensive experience and insights, and thank you for this great conversation, but how do you envision the future in bureaucracy in the digital world? What are actionable strategies that we can learn from? Maybe you have some things that you can give us at hand that we can take away, that we can actually adopt to ensure that we are doing the right thing through our transformation.
Mm-hmm. One, so I deliberately called the book Adaptive Ethics. I figured, that's going to provoke a little bit. But I think that is what is going to happen if we do this right. Just like anything digital, is you make a move and then you inspect. You move forward and then you learn, get feedback and learn. And I think a lot of the ethical questions that don't have obvious solutions because they're entirely new to us, that's the way we're going to solve them. Is we keep a pulse on society and what's important to people. We surface issues as time goes by. Issues will come up for sure, and then we as a collective society, we make decisions about what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior. And if we're following the virtues or the values, whatever you want to call them, we're going to basically be moving in the right direction, and the issues will become clearer and clearer. In the book, I like to play with what I think is kind of the absurd question: is it ethical to kick a robot dog? um, and I think this is a great fun question because if you're worried about that, I think you're off target a little bit. I don't know if that's going to be an issue in the future. We're kind of guessing, but to say today we better make rules, because it's going to come up in the future. I think we're stabbing blindly in the dark. We don't really know whether it's okay. We don't know what robot dogs are going to be like. We don't know whether they're going to be sentient and whatever. But as we go, it's going to become apparent whether that's an important question, among others, right? Maybe at some point we're going to have to think about robot rights and all kinds of things. But I don't want to think about it now because that world is just so far from where we are. It's very hard to have good intuitions about these things. On the other hand, bias in AI is a really interesting area of issues, I should say, really. And as we try to solve the problems of biased AI, we're forced to be more precise about what we mean by bias and what good looks like on these things. And we surface new problems where, maybe if you solve one kind of bias, you're maybe making another kind of bias worse, or, there are areas where different people might be holding different beliefs about what it means to not be biased. And that's great. That's why we have to be adaptive. So as we move down the road, we look at AI, we say, what does this teach us about ourselves and about bias? And how do we as a society, as a global society, want to solve these problems? And how are we going to measure success and things like that? So I think it's an inspect and adapt question more than people really think. And as I said, as a leader, what I want most is for somebody to tell me what the rules are. You know, that removes a lot of the burden from me if somebody else tells me what the rules are. I think my advice to everybody is you can't evade the responsibility. Somehow you're going to have to make decisions, and you should make them as a good person, and that's really the starting point.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a great summary. So we talk about being a good person. I think we also learned that bureaucracy has its good side. I think what I also learned is rules are important, but they're not everything. So we have to step up, and we don't need to define everything today, but we adapt while we are going what those ethical standards are that we want to drive within PMI as an organization and as individuals. So thank you so much again for joining today in our Drive podcast. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. That was fun.
Thank you.